I'm Bill Potter, and I have the honor and the pleasure to moderate this panel on the topic of how viable are nuclear weapons-free zones. I'll also serve as one of the commentators on the panel. The subject is of great personal interest, having been involved in the negotiation of the most recent nuclear weapons-free zone, the Central Asia Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone. It's also a topic of considerable relevance today as more nuclear weapons-free zones are proposed and as a number of existing nuclear weapons-free zones are at risk due to both internal and external challenges. Before I briefly introduce our panelists, I would note that a strong case can be made that nuclear weapons-free zones are among the few disarmament and nonproliferation approaches that have shown considerable success in recent years and also retain significant promise looking forward, although not necessarily in all regions where they have been proposed. In addition to their potential contribution to nonproliferation and disarmament, nuclear weapons-free zones are also relevant to issues of peaceful uses of nuclear energy and preventing nuclear terrorism. Although often unnoticed, much of the world today is covered by nuclear weapons-free zones, and with the entry into force in 2009 of the Central Asia Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone Treaty and the African Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone Treaty, nuclear weapons-free zones are now in force in well over 100 countries in Latin America, the South Pacific, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and Africa, not to mention the nuclear weapons-free space in Mongolia. The entry into force of the Central Asian Nuclear Weapons-Free Zone also signaled the first time a zone extended into the Northern Hemisphere and included territory on which nuclear weapons were previously based. With that short précis, I will now turn to our panelists for their prepared remarks. I will then make a similar presentation, after which time I will open the floor immediately for discussion. I think that's the one thing we haven't had enough of, and that is the interaction between the audience and the panelists. Given the short period we have for this session, I will strictly enforce the time limit for our speakers. I have indicated that they will have no more than 10 minutes, and if they can contract further, that would be much appreciated. Our first speaker is Dr. Emiliano Buis, professor at the University of Buenos Aires Law School and also the School of National Defense in Argentina. Please.
Mm-hmm. So thank you very much. I would like first to thank the organizers from ASAN Institute for having invited me to this extraordinary forum and also for the possibility of sharing some of my thoughts with this wonderful panel of such distinguished experts. The purpose of my remarks would basically consist of tackling what I consider to be a tension. First of all, to acknowledge the importance of nuclear weapons-free zones as an efficient disarmament mechanism, based, of course, on reciprocity, based on a regional approach, which is very much important from a close-up perspective, but at the same time to notice and to state that nuclear weapons-free zones as created by treaties are limited by the will of states. They depend on the consent of states, of the common consent of states, and they depend, of course, on their agreements. So there's a tension there between the importance of these zones and the practical reality of states which have particular intentions. So basically, I will try to mark and to suggest some positive and negative aspects on these nuclear weapons-free zones and to suggest a possible approach in order to improve how they work and how to persuade all actors to respect and to commit themselves to a progressive disarmament. And this approach has to be, in my opinion, gradual, that it's a step-by-step, multidisciplinary, and also global. First of all, some clarification on my background. I'm not a practitioner myself. I worked as a legal advisor at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but basically I'm a professor of international law, so I have a legal background. I'm sorry for that. I am aware of the limitations that this includes, but unlike most lawyers and jurists, I will not look at international law as a positive set of rules which of course it is. I think it's much more than that. So I tend to look at international law as a political instrument. It's a tool that aims at legitimizing some state behaviors. I think that it's not possible to understand law if not related to politics. So this is why I think that it's important to notice that these nuclear weapons-free zones are basically international and legal in their nature. They are created through treaties. And of course, these treaties have binding obligations. If we consider the 5 nuclear weapons-free zones in populated areas, as well as the other areas non-populated, which of course complement the same principles, we notice that basically they are all treaty-based. Even when a state is considered to be a free zone state, like Mongolia, for instance, was also recognized by the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 5533S. So we have an international legal nature of these zones. What are the advantages of these nuclear weapons-free zones? On the one part, they complement quite nicely the NPT. Specifically, they prohibit the deployment, the use, the production, the transfer, and the possession of nuclear weapons in a very specific geographical region. There is, of course, the advantage of regionalism. It's usually easier to start negotiations vis-à-vis our neighboring countries, even though in some cases this could create some additional problems. But in any case, it shows an example of a reciprocal legal control. And this, of course, should be stated as one of the advantages of creating in a certain region a nuclear weapons-free zone. Another positive aspect of these nuclear weapons-free zones are basically the protocols, which we can find in most of these instruments, because they forbid the presence of nuclear weapons by engaging the nuclear powers. So engaging a power that, or a country that is not in the geographical area, that commits itself to not to deploy weapons or use weapons in the region. However, these advantages, they also are complemented by a certain number of shortcomings, a certain number of problems. I will address some of these problems, of course, very quickly. First of all, the purpose. I think that nuclear weapons-free zones are not an end in themselves. They're a means towards a different end, which is the elimination of nuclear weapons. Sometimes in the literature, we perceive that the goal of a certain negotiation is to establish as, let's say, the utmost proposal, a nuclear weapon-free zone. And this should be understood as a way of achieving a possible disarmament. A second problem has to do with verification and compliance. Most of these treaties include very specific control systems. I'm thinking of Tlatelolco, for instance, where you can find in the treaty several articles dealing with this verification system. So we have the IAEA safeguards, we have the reports, we have special inspections. We even have the settlement of disputes to the International Court of Justice, or even in case of violation, the possibility of reaching the United Nations Security Council. However, and despite these verification mechanisms, which we can see in the text, there is, of course, a lack of practical enforcement mechanisms. In practice, it's very difficult to enforce the mechanism. And this is because international law is very difficult to enforce in practice. This is, I think, one of the most important things to consider when dealing with the compliance issue in these nuclear weapons-free zones. What about the scopes of applicability? There we also perceive some specific shortcomings. Of course, there is a geographical scope of applicability which is quite limited, only in specific areas. These areas, of course, are the easy areas around. We don't find basically non-nuclear nuclear weapons-free zones in complicated areas in which we have nuclear powers. And even if 60% of all states are within these nuclear weapons-free areas, the truth is that only 39% of the world's population are living in these areas. There's also a personal scope of applicability which is very limited. We can see no references to non-state actors in all these treaties, which of course also shows the limited approach of these nuclear weapons-free zones. Concerning the material scope of applicability, of course, then we have the whole discussion concerning the transport or transit privileges. This is basically very clear in the Southeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zones. But of course, the nuclear states perceive that the transit is a right according to the principle of the freedom of the seas. So this also becomes quite a complicated issue concerning the effective applicability of this kind of nuclear weapons-free zones. Another interesting shortcoming is the excessive attachment to the NPT dichotomy. So basically, we can reproduce the difference between nuclear countries and non-nuclear countries concerning or based upon this NPT. And this is shown, for instance, when we perceive the problem with the protocols. And this is a legal problem which is very interesting. Basically, you all know that the P5, or the big elephants, as it has been said, they have produced some unilateral declarations, interpretative declarations to a certain extent, in which some of the countries, for instance, I'm thinking of also Tlatelolco, but this repeats itself in other conditions, they preserve the right to use if some circumstances happen. For instance, in the case of Tlatelolco, the United States, United Kingdom, and Russia, with different language, but basically it's the same idea, they preserve a right to use nuclear weapons if states commit an act of aggression with support of a nuclear state, a nuclear weapon state. So basically, we find a problem here because the treaty itself, I'm thinking of Tlatelolco, prohibits reservations, and in fact, these countries have produced these unilateral declarations, which in practice, I think, defeat the object and the purpose of the treaty, which is, of course, one of the basic problems we have here.
1 minute.
So, basically, to conclude, and afterwards we can talk a little bit more about this, I think that the way to go has to do with a different approach. So, a step-by-step approach which should be realistic. I think that it's not possible, thinking of possible new nuclear weapons-free zones, to artificially impose something. This has to be naturally created, and in general, these zones have been produced as a result of common regional interests. So I don't imagine the possibility of imposing nuclear weapon-free zones to countries which don't feel this as a natural way to relate among themselves. The approach should be multilateral and multidisciplinary. Basically, the P5 should understand that respecting this is also in their own interests. I'm thinking of external interests, perhaps some foreign investments, public opinions, internal, perhaps, interests, elections, governability, civil society. So there's a group of elements that perhaps should be taken into account in order to promote the compliance of these treaties. And finally, I suggest a global approach that has perhaps two levels. On the one side, and I'm joining Opanal with its comments, the proposal perhaps of a joint coordination among nuclear weapons-free zones. This is a proposal for the next NPT review conference. And also, I think, a transversal coalition. So basically, forget the difference between nuclear and non-nuclear states, which I don't think is relevant for a nuclear weapons-free zone in this stage, and perhaps think of a possibility of a dialogue, a transversal dialogue, that I think might perhaps foster a progressive disarmament without repeating, repeating traditional structures that I think have been an obstacle to successful negotiations. So thank you very much. I'm sorry.
Thank you. I'm sorry to be abrupt here, but I am going to manage the time here.
Of course.
And we have to set the precedent and apply it to everyone here. So our second speaker is Dr. Chun Chae-sung, Professor of International Relations at Seoul National University and Director of the Asian Security Initiative at the East Asia Institute. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting to this great conference. The question here is how viable nuclear weapon-free zone is. As I'm a South Korean, I will speak from the perspective of Northeast Asia. And actually, this is a rare subject for South Korean academia or the researchers because it is very hard to formulate nuclear weapons-free zone in Northeast Asia. Last year, there was a third North Korean nuclear test, as you know, and there are many nuclear weapon states, including Russia, United States, and China. So this is actually a nuclear weapon proliferating zone rather than free zone. So the question, to this question, my answer will be, it's very hard to have this kind of zone here, but it's something that we can aim for because we can aim high. And there are many good components and inhibiting factors to think about in terms of nuclear-free zones regarding Northeast Asian security architecture. Well, there have been 5 very successful nuclear weapon-free zones. As you know, it's in talking points in Latin America, South Pacific, these areas. And if we try to analyze the reason why they succeeded in formulating this from the perspective of international politics, there are several ways, several components, because it's also a security regime, a very specific kind of security regime. If you want to have a good security regime, there are many conditions. First, great power should assent to formulating this kind of regime. There should be agreement about the security status quo to maintain this type of regime, and there should be consensus about formulating the concept of threats. So only with these specific conditions you can have nuclear-free zones. But what about Northeast Asia? You know, these power factors, interest factors, and identity factors. We are in the midst of power transition, the rise of China, relatively weakening probably of United States, and the rising tensions between China and Japan. So it is not really status quo situations. Maybe all the great powers are expecting the upcoming probably some rivalry, a more harsh competition among these great powers. They want to be prepared to cope with this kind of threat with a certain type of weapon system, including nuclear weapons. So it's very hard at this time to, have an agreement about freezing or reducing, arms, including nuclear weapons. And also there are many very hard security factors, such as, nationalism, Northeast Asian, very specific, security dilemmas between China and Japan. So they also want to be prepared about the upcoming security dilemmas. And also North Korea. If we want to have North Korea with more nuclear tests, it will be very hard to denuclearize not only the Korean Peninsula but also Northeast Asia as a whole. But nuclear weapon free zones have many components, such as you should not manufacture, possess, or introduce nuclear weapons, which is very not feasible in this area. However, the second point is that there are some good points, favorable conditions in this region as well, because we have Japan. Japan has 3 non-nuclear principles: not possessing, not producing, not permitting the introduction of nuclear weapons in this region. We want Japan not to change this. And there was also a joint declaration between South and North Korea on the denuclearization. North Korea broke this consensus. However, South Korea should adhere to this kind of principle. There are many rising voices about South Korea's security preparedness. We have to arm ourselves with nuclear weapons. We have to reintroduce tactical nuclear weapons. I'm really opposed to this kind of idea. We have to stick to the principle of non-proliferation and denuclearization of South Korea. So we have to see whether South Korean public opinion will go. And Mongolia, as Professor Buis just mentioned, the self-declared nuclear weapon-free status, which was recognized by UN very recently. So there are some favorable conditions under which Northeast Asia can accomplish Northeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zones. So what will be a feasible way to go? Well, we have to maintain what we have already to confirm the status of non-nuclear weapon status for South Korea, Japan, and Mongolia. And then we have to work for, anyway, for denuclearization of North Korea. That's the inevitable hurdle that we have to, overcome. There are many ways. It's different subject, but we have to do that. And North Korea knows that. And the difficulty here is that North Korea conceives nuclear weapons not just for strategic reasons, but also for political and diplomatic reasons. They want to use this as a tool for negotiation. So the nuclear weapons free zone is about strategic ideas, but we have to include these political and diplomatic components as well. So if we want to have nuclear weapon free zones, then we have to combine some political and diplomatic element as well. And then we can develop some multilateral security mechanism here, which is also very difficult, but we studied this in Northeast Asia at Track 2 level or under the six-party talks. So there could be some possibility. And then we can work to solve the security dilemma between the United States and China. It's a very hard subject as well. There might be a more cooperation between two countries, but there could be a rising security dilemma, which may include the nuclear, the antagonism between these countries. And the last point is that, well, we can expand the scope of these nuclear weapon free zones, including some other nuclear components, such as 3S components. In 2010, South Korea hosted nuclear summit meeting. So nuclear security is a very important subject to deal with nuclear issues. We might include this nuclear security in East Asia as an issue for this kind of an efforts. Also, safety issue after Fukushima issues. It's a little bit distant, but we can start from a low level or more easy issues, and then try to have a spillover effect on a more harsh, more difficult subject. And also non-proliferation issue, on which every state in this region agree. So by broadening the agenda and try to protect what we already have, then we may have a very slight chance to accomplish this nuclear free zones.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. I particularly appreciate the brevity of your remarks. I'm sure our next speaker will follow that precedent as well. He is Dr. Peter Hayes, co-founder and executive director of the Nautilus Institute and professor of international relations at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. He is someone I've turned to since his graduate school days, whenever I have needed counsel about nuclear developments on the Korean Peninsula. Peter.
Thank you, Bill, and I'd like to thank Asan Institute for their tremendous support for the speakers, including myself. I'm very glad to be back in Seoul, even though it is very cold. A Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone, I think, is viable. It's badly needed. Indeed, it's actually necessary to solve the nuclear issues of this region, but it's not sufficient in and of itself to bring about an end to the nuclear threat. What I have to say builds on nearly 20 years of research in this region on nuclear weapon-free zones in Northeast Asia, so I have not a lot of new things to say about it. In particular, the work of Professor Umebayashi, who is now setting up a new research center at the University of Nagasaki, for which this zone concept is a key research priority. Also the work of S.W. Cheon here in Korea, in his co-authored work with Dr. Tatsuhiro Suzuki on the concept of a Korea-Japan nuclear weapon-free zone. The work of John Endicott, former U.S. Air Force officer now in charge of a business school based in Daejeon, nearly a decade of meetings of senior military officers involving China, Japan, Korea, United States, and others on a limited nuclear weapon-free zone in Northeast Asia. Indeed, the first study that I know of, serious conceptual study of a nuclear weapon-free zone in this region, was actually done for the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency in 1963. So there's been a lot of work done on nuclear weapon-free zones over the years. We also have the pioneering work of the Mongolian nuclear weapon-free zone of One, and the work of Blue Banner. And then in our own work at Nautilus, we have the Breaking the Gridlock workshop last October in Washington, D.C., nearly 25 papers from specialists, my admirals, generals, and ambassadors conference. And we had the East Asia Nuclear Security workshop on this concept in November 2011 in Tokyo, co-sponsored by the Asia Pacific Leadership Network of Gareth Evans and about 30 retired foreign and prime ministers. So there's been considerable ferment over the last couple of years as we've come to recognize that we don't have a strategic framework in this region to either manage nuclear insecurities between the nuclear weapon states or the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, most spectacularly, but not only the North Koreans. And my own view is that we need to shift from trying to shape behaviors incrementally at the margin to shaping the strategic environment. And the last time the United States as a great power did such was actually in 1991 on September the 28th when President Bush unilaterally withdrew tactical and theater nuclear weapons from the region, and as a result there was a whole slew of constructive and positive changes that took place, and that was because he was not trying to change a particular behavior, he was trying to change the incentive structure as a whole. And it worked. It didn't solve the problem, but it worked. There was a crucial missing element, which is that China did not ensure that the United States cross-recognized Pyongyang at the time that Beijing recognized Seoul. If that mistake had not been made by the two great powers at that time, everything we're dealing with today would be different. In a sense, a nuclear weapon-free zone is an attempt to recover from that very crucial strategic error in 1991. Now, in my view, the reason that we need a nuclear weapon-free zone in this region actually doesn't revolve around North Korea. The main reason is to establish a framework that addresses the most important nuclear risks in this region, which are first and foremost in the Taiwan Straits between the United States and China over the Taiwan issue. Secondly, moderating the Sino-Japanese conflict relationship and the proliferation potential therein. And thirdly, keeping South Korea non-nuclear, particularly if North Korea collapses and they inherit North Korea's nuclear weapons. We need to have a very clear picture now of what happens to North Korea's nuclear weapons. And only lastly are we on about capturing North Korea's nuclear breakout and turning that around. In a sense, this is the inverse of the political urgency that we feel here in Seoul over the last few days, but I think it's the underlying fundamental vital interests that drive this picture. The only framework that I think that can manage these four kinds of nuclear insecurities and the cross-cutting interests of the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states is a regional nuclear weapon-free zone. And if I may say so, the contribution of the Nautilus Institute in this dialogue that goes back so many years is that in order to get a nuclear weapon-free zone, we believe that a comprehensive security settlement, as articulated by Morton Halperin at our two conferences over the last 2 years, is necessary, that entails a number of constituent elements, not just the zone, in order for a zone to be plausible and desirable. Those elements include, first and foremost, the termination of the state of war. And this should be done in a treaty framework. Perhaps it's a treaty of amity and cooperation, modeled in some respects after the Southeast Asian Treaty. Perhaps it's just a new treaty of its own. But you begin with the termination of the state of war of the four parties to the Korean conflict, the two Koreas, the United States and China. You need to create a permanent council on security to monitor the agreement. The states involved must declare mutually that they have no hostile intent. There should be provisions for assistance with respect to nuclear and other energy, in particular, but not only for North Korea. There should be a termination of sanctions, progressive over time, and there should be a creation of a nuclear weapon-free zone, itself a complex architecture. Now, with respect to North Korea, the key issue for North Korea is how valuable would be a legally binding guarantee in treaty form from the United States, backed multilaterally by the other nuclear weapon states, as happens in a nuclear weapon-free zone, to it versus the value of maintaining itself as an isolated, poor but nuclear armed state. And in my view, engaging it is the only way to find out. And if they were to say yes, then we would make room for them either to enter as a nuclear armed state to such a zone at the very outset, but providing time for them to come into compliance, in effect updating the mechanism that was used in the Treaty of Tlatelolco to allow Argentina and Brazil to enter in spite of some anomalous status that they had at the time with respect to their capacities and intentions. Or you can simply leave the door open for the North Koreans to collapse into the zone or choose to come into it later. It doesn't really matter that much which way you go, because the zone isn't being set up primarily to accommodate North Korea. It's being set up to achieve much bigger strategic interests between the powers that then set in place the constraints and the opportunities that North Korea would then be confronted with and do what it wishes to. To answer one of the specific questions that we were asked to address, and I'll put this in a very short form, yes, a nuclear weapon-free zone in this region can be verified, monitored and verified, even in North Korea. And for those who are skeptical on the North Korea side, I'd simply refer you to the paper by Olli Heinonen, which we commissioned on this topic. It's on the Breaking the Gridlock website. This can be done even with respect to their uranium enrichment capacities, is my belief. Finally, there are many issues that would need to be tailored specifically to the circumstances of this region. Should the nuclear fuel cycle cooperation be included or done as a side arrangement, side agreement? Would it include missiles? What is the impact on such a zone of theater missile defense? What's the geography of the zone? Is it two nuclear weapon states, Korea and Japan, plus 3 immediately adjacent nuclear weapon states? Or is it a broader concept which could include Mongolia, Canada, Japan and South Korea at the outset, plus the 3 adjacent nuclear weapon states? Should it include the UK and France as well at the outset? And finally, should it include Taiwan, again in a side arrangement with a unilateral declaration by Taiwan that it would meet the obligations of non-nuclear weapon states, and by China asserting as a nuclear weapon state that its commitment actually already covers Taiwan.
Peter, I'm going to have to ask you to
Right.
wrap up there.
So that is really well where I'll end. How's that?
Thank you very much. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Tham Minh Tuan, Assistant to the Deputy Prime Minister in Vietnam and also Associate Professor at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. Tuan?
Thank you, Bill. I would like to thank ASEAN for inviting me to this important forum, and I'm going to express directly 2 questions given to me by the organizers. Number 1 is whether the nuclear weapons-free zone is viable, and number 2, the prospect of the nuclear weapons-free zones in the Middle East and Northeast Asia. I concur with in one piece. The most important point is that nuclear weapons-free zone is viable. But for me, in order to make it viable, we need to meet at least 4 concurrent conditions. Number 1, the treaty which establishes the nuclear weapons-free zones must be comprehensive, at least in 2 aspects. First, it must contain articles about verification and enforcement in details. For example, our Argentinian colleagues just mentioned the Treaty of Tlatelolco. It established, the control system in Article 12, which stipulates verification of compliance with obligation. And from Article 12 to Article 18, it details, the verification and enforcement mechanisms, including inspection procedures, report in case of violations, or Treaty of Rarotonga. It also provides control system in Article 8, and then detailing everything in Article 9 and 10 and Annex 2. And second aspect is that the treaty must establish a regional organization or a body to take on the job of verification and enforcement. In case of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, it established APONA, Agency for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and Caribbean, to supervise the compliance. And it has very close structural organizations, which includes General Conference, Council, and Secretariat, which establish procedures for control system to ensure observance of the treaties. I think this is very important. We don't have this with the Bangkok Treaty in Southeast Asia. We don't have this kind of organizations. So it's one of the weaknesses of SONFES, Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapons Free Zones. Nobody is actually supervise the compliance in Southeast Asia at all. Then the second condition is that each party to the zone must, I think, willingly and voluntarily make domestic legislation to enforce the treaties. For instance, the countries have to make into laws the prohibitions of manufacturers of nuclear weapons, or the dumping of nuclear radioactive waste in its territorial sea or in the zone. Few countries does it actually, and I think when it comes to international treaties, after all, it's a responsibility of individual countries to meet its requirement, to meet its commitment. If you don't really care about how your domestic laws in conforming with the international treaties that you signed up, then it's unlikely that you really want to keep your commitment firmly. And then third, the regional organization or a body charged with verification and enforcement tasks must take action when violation occurs. This is important because, after all, an organization established for a certain purpose, and when violation occurs, you don't take action, or you just ignore it. Then a violation continues to goes on, and it would erode the meaning of the zone. And in case of Southeast Asia, we have in the Treaty of Bangkok the fact-finding mission articles, but it is never evoked to for example, examine Myanmar's case, the alleged nuclear programs. Even when outside powers try to encourage ASEAN to take action, but no countries at all to come forward and did it. So I think if regional organization cannot do it, then who else? And last but not least, I think nuclear weapon states must respect nuclear weapons free zone and their commitment to the zone, because it is the nuclear weapon states that actually plays a key role in the nuclear free zones. If you don't do that, if you ignore your commitment, then the zone becomes futile, meaningless. Most of the members of the zone are developing countries. We don't have that technology to detect whether your ship, transiting our territorial sea, carrying nuclear weapons or not, or even the ship docked into our port with nuclear weapons. We don't know. We simply don't know. So we rely mostly on your honesty and real commitment to the zone. That's the four conditions that I think we must meet in order for a viable nuclear weapons-free zone. Now, for a prospect of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East and Northeast Asia, for the Middle East, I think it's not happening in the near future. And for Northeast Asia, I think it's very, very difficult. Besides some recent mentions, I would say four, according to my mind, four reasons that I don't see it happens anytime soon. Number one, there exists deep running mistrust amongst regional countries because either of historical baggage or the current problems, for example, between Israel and the rest of the Middle East, the Arab world, or between Iran and even the rest of the Middle East, with Iran's nuclear ambition. Or in Northeast Asia, we have Japan, China, and South Korea. That's the historical baggage between them, on even current problem arising between them. And then we have a very complex political reality in the region, in Northeast Asia, and in the Middle East as well. Regional countries' political, military linkages with the outside powers really play a role. For example, Israel and U.S. and U.S., Japan, and ROK's alliance. So these regional countries in Northeast Asia and in the Middle East do not really have complete freedom of choice when it comes to security issues, such as nuclear free zones. And here there's absence of formal regional security arrangement similar to ASEAN Regional Forum, which lay a stepping stone for further securities, CBMs. So I think it's not. We are not here yet. And then big powers' interest in both regions. We have for example, in Northeast Asia, we have North Korea, drawing much attention from the big powers, and conflicting, big power interests have further complicated the security situation here, and perhaps widening the mistrust between parties. So it's difficult. And number three, nuclear weapon-free zones is impossible if there is a nuclear weapon state in the zone. After all, what is the point if you have a weapon state, nuclear weapon state inside the zone? So I think in the Middle East we have, Israel, and here in Northeast Asia we have China, perhaps we have Russia, and if North Korea were to abandon its nuclear weapons, still we have South Korea's, I think, if my memory is correct, the United States reserved its right to reintroduce tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea. So that kind of things is make it difficult for Northeast Asia to have a zone. And last but not least, it happens here in Northeast Asia and in Southeast Asia, territorial disputes. Rarely do we hear of this kind of things in the nuclear weapons-free zone, but it does play a role because in Northeast Asia, recently we have a territorial dispute. In Southeast Asia, is telling story because if we cannot solve these problems, then it will severely affect the definition of the zone of application. How do you? After all, the zone is geographical zone. So if we have territorial dispute within the zone, then we have big problems. How to define, the zone of application, and this is precisely the problem of Southwest, Southeast Asia nuclear weapons-free zone at this point. Why China, Russia, and United States and others have not agreed yet to sign up to the protocol, because one of the sticky points is a dispute, territorial disputes.
I'm going to have to ask you to...
Okay, thank you. That's my last.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. Let me try to wrap up, and then we'll use the remaining time for Q&A. I think we have a couple of extra minutes since we started late as well. I think one of the things that we've gleaned from our discussion so far is that while there are common elements to nuclear weapons-free zones, there are also a number of distinctive characteristics. And by the same token, while there are some specific obstacles to overcome in negotiating any nuclear weapons-free zone, there also are a number of general obstacles to overcome. And I would highlight a few of them. I think, first of all, one has to overcome the question of the definition of the geographical scope of the zone. One has to figure out the activities to be prohibited or permitted within the zone. There are obviously conflicting interests of prospective zonal members that have to be addressed. There is the question of the relationship of the new zone to other international agreements, something that was particularly complicated for the Central Asian nuclear weapons-free zone. And then there are the concerns of the extra-zonal parties, typically the concerns of the nuclear weapon states, who may be conflicted between the desire to negotiate an iron-tight prohibition against the presence of nuclear weapons in any particular zone, and the desire to honor various treaties, defense treaties, for example, that may be in place at the time of the negotiation of the zone. I would argue that a relatively new obstacle that threatens the long-term viability and integrity of existing nuclear weapons-free zones, as well as the value of future nuclear weapons-free zones, is the inclination of parties to some zones to disregard legally binding provisions that they view as economically or politically inconvenient. This disturbing trend, it's disturbing in my view, is most noticeable with respect to the failure on the part of an increasing number of states to ignore commitments not to engage in nuclear trade with countries lacking full-scope safeguards. These restrictive provisions are explicit in the treaties of Rarotonga and Pelindaba, and the Central Asian Treaty is even more restrictive in that it requires the recipients of all nuclear trade to also have in place the additional protocol to the IAEA. And yet countries such as Australia, South Africa, and Kazakhstan now act as if there are no treaty obligations in this regard. So I would make the point here that just as it's intolerable for nuclear weapon states to selectively implement their NPT obligations, so it's impermissible for non-nuclear weapon states to ignore economically inconvenient legal and or political commitments that they've undertaken. To do so, I think, undermines not only their specific nuclear weapons-free zone treaties, but the value of future treaties. And it also addresses their role as principal advocates for disarmament and nonproliferation. You can't have it both ways. So what I'd like to do by way of conclusion is to mention a few lessons from the Central Asian experience. I'm pleased that Gary Seymour is in the audience here because I recall one of my lessons in a moment that relates particularly to the U.S., and he can challenge me if I've mistaken my talking points here. But I would argue that the as yet unfulfilled promise of the Central Asian nuclear weapons-free zone is the result of a combination of circumstances that include bad luck, bureaucratic inertia, erratic leadership, intra-regional disputes, high politics, and short-sighted emphasis on immediate economic interests over non-proliferation considerations. And if I had more time, I'd elaborate on these different points. But let me simply conclude by noting two key lessons from the Central Asian experience that I think may be relevant to the possible negotiation of their zones. The first one lesson I would point to is to seize the moment. Basically, while patience is fine, delay can be disastrous. An open door can shut at any time. Zonal advocates can evaporate as leaders pass from the scene. and the stars are rarely, if ever, perfectly aligned. For example, in the case of Central Asia, Russia initially paid little attention to the zone because it thought that nothing would materialize. Senior government officials, including Gary, I would argue, initially were supportive of the zone because they realized its implementation would greatly favor U.S. strategic interests in the region by constraining Russian nuclear deployments. That being said, mid-level U.S. government officials insisted on rigidly applying an existing set of criteria for zones without regard to the impact of U.S. interests in the specific region, the problem of dealing with the interagency process and bureaucracy. Moreover, there was a tendency in both the United States and Russia to assume that if one side liked the zone, it must be bad for the other, even if they couldn't figure out precisely why that was the case. And that delayed things for years. The second lesson I would suggest is to tailor the zone to regional peculiarities and perceived common interests. Nuclear weapons-free zones vary in the activities that are prohibited and permitted, and each zone tends to introduce distinctively new features. In the case of the 5 Central Asian states, the glue that made it possible to negotiate a treaty was the common environmental damage inflicted by Soviet mining and milling of uranium. It had nothing, or it had very little to do with typical non-proliferation or disarmament concerns. The lesson I derive from this experience for advocates of new zones is to clearly articulate a rationale for the zone that appeals to the core interests of the parties in the zone. In conclusion, I would acknowledge that most nuclear weapons-free zones treaties are far from perfect, and in retrospect might have been improved in a variety of ways. That being said, the same argument could be made of all negotiated treaties, including the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Moreover, in some regions lacking a history of cooperation on issues of peace and security, nuclear weapons-free zones may offer a potential mechanism to further regional cooperation. In short, I would argue that proponents of nuclear weapons-free zones must seize upon the opportunities as they appear. They have to be open to new approaches for extending the reach of nuclear weapons-free space. And most importantly, they have to be attentive to fulfilling and implementing the provisions of existing zones as to advocating the negotiation of new zones. So why don't I conclude? I think I actually kept within the same time limit that I insisted upon for other members of the group. And breaking with precedent here, rather than my asking questions of the panelists, I'd like to devote the remaining 20 minutes that we have to fielding questions from the audience. So with that, I would ask if you have a question to raise your hand. I'll try to recognize you, and then our panelists will respond. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Young-Shik Bong at Asan Institute. I'm not an expert on nuclear matters, but I do research on territorial disputes in Northeast Asia. So my question is directly to Dr. Tang. Just for the sake of thinking outside the box, territorial disputes will be easily regarded as obstacles to international cooperation to create a nuclear-free zone. But I have also heard some counter-arguments that maybe that's a good starting point for very low level of cooperation among disputant countries. You don't aim at resolving the territorial disputes themselves, but you just pay attention to certain areas of possible cooperation. Because regardless of the territorial disputes, these countries have to deal with the issue of free navigation of foreign vessels in their waters. So if these countries start working on some regimes that would help govern better the navigations of, say, nuclear vessels or submarines, then they might trigger higher level of cooperation in the end.
Go ahead, Tuan.
Yes, I think if you can do that, that's great. Because more often than not, we consider territorial disputes as obstacle to initiating the nuclear weapons-free zone. You're right. The counter argument could be, it could be a good starting point. When you can cooperate. The problems are twofold. Number one. Eventually, when it comes to the treaties establishing the zone, you have to define clearly, the zone of applications. Then, that dispute, the territorial dispute, will come to the fore. That's inevitable. Maybe you can manage it by, reservations, putting reservation in the treaties, but somehow you cannot avoid it. You have to talk about it, number one, and it could complicate the process, the negotiation process, for example, or even the definition of the zone of application, as I mentioned. The other thing is that, you need to get approval, not approval, but the signatures on, for example, on the protocols of the treaties from the nuclear weapon states. Then it comes to the relations between individual countries, individual members of the zone with the nuclear power states. So, the case of ASEAN is telling because, some nuclear weapon states could agree to the protocols regardless of the territorial dispute, but 2 or 3 others do not. They want Southeast Asia's country to come together first to find a solution, and then to make a so-called package with them. So I don't rule out the possibility of taking the problems as an advantage, to kick off the negotiation of the process. But at the end of the day, you have to deal with it.
Yes. Other questions? Please.
Tatsu Suzuki from Japan. I'm encouraged by the proposal made by both Peter and Dr. Chan regarding Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zones. But I have a question to Dr. Chan particularly, maybe also Peter can answer. You said that, if I'm not mistaken, South Korea should stick to the non-nuclear declaration by Korean Peninsula, which means that you are suggesting the nuclear weapon-free zone should include no nuclear fuel cycle facilities. If that's the case, what should we do about Japanese nuclear fuel cycle facilities? It will be very difficult. So my question is whether the nuclear weapon-free zone should include civilian nuclear fuel cycle facilities.
Please.
Well, non-nuclearization should the principle that I really think it's important. If we develop nuclear weapons because of the North Korean threat, then we have to walk out of the NPT and try to manufacture nuclear weapons, which will be a disaster to South Korean national interest. So we should not do that. Reprocessing. Now we're in the midst of negotiation with the United States. It's economically disadvantageous. It's scientifically probably convenient to technicians. But personally, I think as a middle power or a important regional power, we should first stick to the principle non-proliferation first. If we prove ourselves as a proponent of globally and regionally non-proliferation, then some doubts or some questions of South Korea's possibility of going to nuclear weapons by having reprocessing power will be gone. So there is some steps that we have to go through first. As a political scientist, I think we have to combine, the perspective of non-proliferation and reprocessing, that kind of technical, pyroprocessing, all these things. But we have to combine this anyway. But in South Korea, as an observer, I think there is separate voices which do not contribute a coherent national interest yet. So we have to finish the negotiation by the end of, maybe by the summer of this year. So it's hard. But personally, I think, we have to have more combined approach.
Dr. did you want to follow up on this? Or?
Japan, I don't know. Well, you don't have any intention to, manufacture any nuclear weapons, but in Japan there is voices about the cost of continuing reproducing. So maybe there is some suggestions about multilateral regional reprocessing, that kind of some other ways to go. But it's about your national interest. I think we can talk together regionally and then find a solution.
Well, there's actually nothing inconsistent with the two Koreas being committed to a more stringent set of conditions than the other non-nuclear parties that might include Japan, Mongolia, Canada. But politically speaking, if a zone is able to capture over time North Korea, it seems to me it's a price South Korea should be willing to pay for there to be a degree of external discrimination, particularly the United States, towards its treatment with respect to Japan versus that accorded to Korea. And over time, my own belief is that the market will drive South Korea to recognize the economic realities of the fuel cycle, as it will Japan, and the two parties will converge on less and less emphasis on fast breeder reactors, and with the diminution and eventual disappearance of fast breeder reactors, the case for reprocessing and recycling will evaporate, and so over time the whole issue will actually solve itself. It's a secondary issue, so the zone should focus on the primary issue, which is the threat to use nuclear weapons to destroy cities. That's the primary issue for the zone in this region. Everything else should be treated as a subordinate or side issue. Important, because to actually get a deal with North Korea, there's going to have to be some side arrangement involving fuel cycle cooperation of one kind or another with North Korea. So it won't go away, but it shouldn't be the primary issue in the design of the zone itself.
Do I see any other questions? I'll ask the panel questions if I don't see some from the audience. As I think most of you are, if not all of you are aware, there were a set of guidelines or principles for nuclear weapons-free zones that were adopted at the UN Disarmament Commission a number of years ago, I think in the mid-90s. And one of the key elements or principles was that the impetus for the zone should emanate from the states in the region. And I think one of the most important features of zones is that they're not imposed by the nuclear weapon states, that in fact these are treaties that are endorsed by the states in the region. Given that principle, how would you say that that applies with respect to Northeast Asia? Peter, you want us?
Well, I'll take a sort of opening stab at it. First of all, whilst nuclear weapon-free zones are not in a legal sense part or a linked system to the NPT itself, they are in effect part of the NPT set of instruments. And if you remove yourself from the NPT set of instruments, as North Korea has done, and become a nuclear armed as against a nuclear weapons or a non-nuclear weapons state with a capital N NPT status, I don't think that you actually fall under the guidelines related to the creation of nuclear weapon-free zones directly, and you shouldn't be allowed to obstruct it. There's no definition in those guidelines of what constitutes region either. There's no requirement that region be geographically contiguous, which is why, for example, Mongolia could form part of a nuclear weapon-free zone if one wanted it to be. And there's no requirement that that region be completely inclusive of all states. So also these are not binding legal requirements, they're basically guidelines, and what you really have to do in the hard case is think through over time possibly over considerable time, what would bring all states to a convergence and a consensus that the zone is a status that they should all take upon themselves and fully obligate themselves to commit to actually fulfill all the requirements of the zone. And in that sense, if North Korea wants to remain an outlaw and an outlier, they have a lot of time to sit in that box outside a regional zone. But I don't think that the other states in the region should sit on their hands because North Korea doesn't want to play that game. And finally, there's nothing that says that the nuclear weapon states should not take a leadership role in articulating the zone, and the political reality is that without a US-China concert on this issue, nothing will happen of significance. So the nuclear weapon states will have to play a leading role, not a substitute for the other kinds of support and leadership that the non-nuclear weapon states will also have to provide in their own manner and in their own interests. But in this region, tailored to the circumstances and the geostrategic realities, unless you have the United States and China in a front position, you're not going to deal with the realities of either North Korea or the political imperatives of South Korea and Japan to bring about a zone.
The only thing I would note is that the UN Disarmament Commission consists of parties that are not necessarily party to the NPT. So this was not an NPT-generated set of principles. It was a
Yep,
broader,
no, I understand.
a broader
Yep.
body. Do I have anyone else on that particular question? Do we have any other questions from the audience here? Let me do the following, since we have 5 minutes left. Give the opportunity to each of the panelists if they would like to make some concluding remarks, and maybe we'll proceed in the reverse order. So, Tuan, if you want to, is there anything that you would like to add by way of a concluding statement or some remarks?
Well, actually, even though I'm a bit skeptical about the Middle East, this nuclear weapons-free zone and the zone in Southeast Asia, but I really think that we can make it happen because the realities has proved the otherwise, that even in Southeast Asia during the Cold War, such a zone could be established amongst contrasting parties, and then of course later on countries like Vietnam joined more than 10 years later. But I mean, the gentleman sitting over there just actually touched upon a very important point when he asked questions about the territorial dispute. It actually is sticky point, but it can start it from something like that. We turn the disadvantage into advantage somehow, and I think if Korea and Japan, I think Bill, you asked the questions who should be the initiators of the zone in Northeast Asia. I think Japan and South Korea could be initiators. If you can work together closely, maybe you can put up very good proposals, and then you present it to China, get China on board. I think that could happen. Otherwise, I think it's difficult because these two key players in the region.
Thank you. Peter?
Well, first, I just note that if one was to implement a zone in this region, it would entail real change in the posture of different states. For example, the United States would have to explicitly give up the right that it reserved to reintroduce nuclear weapons, a right that it asserted unilaterally in 1991, 1991. That would be inconsistent, I think, with signing the protocols to a nuclear weapon-free zone to assert that right. Conversely, what would also be rather distinctive about a zone in this part of the world is that nuclear extended deterrence would continue in a very dilute and recessed fashion to continue to flow through and around the zone by virtue of the alliance relationships and the continuing threat relationship between the nuclear weapon states in the region. And that's a good and a bad thing for the zone world, for this zone and for zones in general, but it's a realistic position. It also happens to, I think, realign perceptions of the Allies with the adjustment in the American posture after 1991, when those forward-deployed nuclear weapons were withdrawn completely, and yet in many respects the South Korean and Japanese allies continued to think and perceive the situation as if those weapons were still forward deployed, but they're not and haven't been for 20 years. For Japan, for example, as I understand it, the definition of territory that's covered by the 3 non-nuclear principles was specifically designed to create an international transit zone in the Straits to allow nuclear warships of adversary states as well as the United States to travel through unchallenged by the non-nuclear principles. So there would be probably some need to adjust domestic legal arrangements like that to what would probably be a 12-mile nautical zone territorial definition for the zone as a whole. So there are practical institutional obstacles that would have to be overcome, say, in Japan. And then finally, I just want to say with respect to North Korea, no one knows how valuable a legally binding guarantee of non-nuclear attack from the United States, backed by the other nuclear weapon states, would be to North Korea. We simply don't know, and it may be a long time before we find out, but unless we ask, we'll never get the answer. And we've never put it on the table before.
Thanks. Dr. Chen?
Okay, three short points. One is the relationship between NPT and the zone. The North Korea is always complaining that the United States is not providing negative security to North Korea, which is a reason for their developing nuclear weapons, which is wrong, you know. So only if North Korea goes back to NPT, then the outside, including U.S., can provide negative security assurance. So it is combined. We have to combine the regional and global levels at the same time. The second, nuclear weapons-free zone is a very ideal concept for Northeast Asians. However, it's a linguistic kind of practice. It can stimulate our imagination. If North Korea hears that, well, the outside powers are thinking about nuclear-free, weapons-free zone in which North Korea can survive, then they might try to think differently, which is also a very slim chance, but we can try. Third thing, most importantly, we have to weaken the usefulness of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons is very useful, you know, in many senses. You can use it in a war as a last resort. It's a very powerful deterrent. You can use it as the negotiating tool. You can, you know, brag about your achievement if you have a nuclear weapons, like in North Korea. So you have to weaken all these advantages, which is very difficult. We can expect territorial war, as Dr. Bong just asked. But if we expect some all-out war coming from the territorial disputes, then you have no reason to give up nuclear weapons. So we have to work on the security base, you know, the underlying structure, and then start to talk about the superstructure, which is a regime.
Yeah, well, since I spoke too much at the first part of this, I will try to reduce my comments to a very few aspects. It seems very interesting for me that, being, I think, the only lawyer in the panel, I am the least inclined to believe in the success of future treaties creating nuclear weapons free zones. Of course, I understand that, lacking of a universal treaty that might promote progressive disarmament as such, of course, this partial way of dealing with the subject in regional areas could be a useful way to go. But again, I don't think that this is an end in itself, but only a means towards achieving a complete and global progressive disarmament. My doubt concerning this is that perhaps when one thinks of this kind of nuclear weapons free zones, one tends to look at this as an homogeneous area. And in fact, the interests of the parties within the zone are, of course, very different. And they're different, of course, to the interest by the P5. So my question concerning the possibility of thinking nuclear weapons free zone in Northeast Asia with the problem of excluding, for the moment, North Korea would be if this could, to a certain extent, promote the feeling that these countries are outlaws. So I guess we should be very careful in order to promote a belief that we could think of a nuclear weapon-free zone, excluding from the beginning some states and thinking of a virtual possibility of then opening the door.
I think as we conclude, it's worth observing that most nuclear weapons-free zones have taken a very long time to negotiate, and it's taken even much longer to gain ratification of the protocols by the nuclear weapon states. So it's useful to bear that in mind. And finally, I would just urge you, as you think about new nuclear weapons-free zones, to remember that it's only as good as the practice of the parties to the zone. And so we need to be really very attentive to honoring the obligations of existing zones, or it's much more difficult to make the case for future zones. So please join me in thanking our panelists.